Chapter 33 of Wives and Daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 33. Brightening Prospects. It was a day or two afterwards that Mr. Gibson made time to ride round by Hamley, desirous to learn more exact particulars of this scheme for Roger than he could obtain from any extraneous source, and rather puzzled to know whether he should interfere in the project or not. The state of the case was this. Osborne's symptoms were, in Mr. Gibson's opinion, signs of his having a fatal disease. Dr. Nicholls had differed from him on this head, and Mr. Gibson knew that the old physician had had long experience and was considered very skilful in the profession. Still he believed that he himself was right, and if so, the complaint was one which might continue for years in the same state as at present, or might end the young man's life in an hour, a minute. Supposing that Mr. Gibson was right, would it be well for Roger to be away where no sudden calls for his presence could reach him? Away for 2 years? Yet, if the affair was concluded, the interference of a medical man might accelerate the very evil to be feared, and after all Dr. Nicholls might be right, and the symptoms might proceed from some other cause. Might? Yes. Probably did? No. Mr. Gibson could not bring himself to say yes to this latter form of sentence. So he rode on, meditating, his reins slack, his head bent a little. It was one of those still and lovely autumn days when the red and yellow leaves are hanging pegs to dewy, brilliant gossamer webs, when the hedges are full of trailing brambles, loaded with ripe blackberries, when the air is full of the farewell whistles and pipes of birds, clear and short, not the long full-throated warbles of spring, when the whir of the partridges' wings is heard in the stubble-fields, as the sharp hoof-blows fall on the paved lanes, when here and there a leaf floats and flutters down to the ground, although there is not a single breath of wind. The country surgeon felt the beauty of the seasons perhaps more than most men. He saw more of it day by day, by night, in storm and sunshine, or in the still soft cloudy weather. He never spoke about what he felt on the subject. Indeed, he did not put his feelings into words, even to himself. But if his mood ever approached to the sentimental, it was on such days as this. He rode into the stable-yard, gave his horse to a man, and went into the house by a side entrance. In the passage he met the squire.
"That's capital, Gibson. What good wind blew you here? You'll have some lunch? It's on the table. I only just this minute left the room."
And he kept shaking Mr. Gibson's hand all the time till he had placed him, nothing loath, at the well-covered dining-table.
"What's this I hear about Roger?"
said Mr. Gibson, plunging at once into the subject.
"Aha, so you've heard, have you? It's famous, isn't it? He's a boy to be proud of, is old Roger. Steady Roger. We used to think him slow, but it seems to me that slow and sure wins the race. But tell me, what have you heard? How much is known? Nay, you must have a glassful. It's old ale, such as we don't brew nowadays. It's as old as Osborne. We brewed it that autumn, and we called it the young squire's ale. I thought to have tapped it on his marriage, but I don't know when that will come to pass, so we've tapped it now in Roger's honour."
The old squire had evidently been enjoying the young squire's ale to the verge of prudence. It was indeed, as he said, as strong as brandy, and Mr. Gibson had to sip it very carefully as he ate his cold roast beef.
"Well, and what have you heard? There's a deal to hear, and all good news, though I shall miss the lad, I know that."
"I did not know it was settled. I only heard that it was in progress."
"Well, it was only in progress, as you call it, till last Tuesday. He never let me know anything about it, though. He says he thought I might be fidgety with thinking of the pros and cons, so I never knew a word on it until I had a letter from my Lord Hollingford. Where is it?"
Pulling out a great black leathern receptacle for all manner of papers, and putting on his spectacles, he read aloud their headings.
"Measurement of timber, new railings, drench for cows from Father Hayes, Dobson's accounts. Here it is. Now read that letter,"
handing it to Mr. Gibson. It was a manly, feeling, sensible letter, explaining to the old father in very simple language the services which were demanded by the terms of the will to which he and 2 or 3 others were trustees, the liberal allowance for expenses, the still more liberal reward for performance, which had tempted several men of considerable renown to offer themselves as candidates for the appointment. Lord Hollingford then went on to say that, having seen a good deal of Roger lately, since the publication of his article in reply to the French osteologist, he had had reason to think that in him the trustees would find united the various qualities required in a greater measure than in any of the applicants who had at that time presented themselves. Roger had deep interest in the subject, much acquired knowledge, and at the same time great natural powers of comparison and classification of facts. He had shown himself to be an observer of a fine and accurate kind. He was of the right age, in the very prime of health and strength, and unshackled by any family ties. Here Mr. Gibson paused for consideration. He hardly cared to ascertain by what steps the result had been arrived at. He already knew what the result was. But when his mind was again arrested as his eye caught on the remuneration offered, which was indeed most liberal, and then he read with attention the high praise bestowed on the son in this letter to the father. The squire had been watching Mr. Gibson, waiting till he came to this part, and rubbed his hands together as he said,
"Aye, you've come to it at last. It's the best part of the whole, isn't it? God bless the boy! And from a Whig, mind you, which makes it the more handsome. And there's more to come still. I say, Gibson, I think my luck is turning at last."
Passing him on yet another letter to read.
"That only came this morning, but I've acted on it already. I sent for the foreman of the drainage works at once, I did, and to-morrow, please God, they'll be at work again."
Mr. Gibson read the second letter from Roger. To a certain degree it was a modest repetition of what Lord Hollingford had said, with an explanation of how he had come to take so decided a step in life without consulting his father. He did not wish him to be in suspense for one reason. Another was that he felt, as no one else could feel for him, that by accepting this offer he entered upon the kind of life for which he knew himself to be most fitted. And then he merged the whole into business. He said that he knew well the suffering his father had gone through when he had had to give up his drainage works for want of money, that he, Roger, had been enabled at once to raise money upon the remuneration he was to receive on the accomplishment of his 2 years' work, and that he also had insured his life in order to provide for the repayment of the money he had raised, in case he did not live to return to England. He said that the sum he had borrowed on this security would at once be forwarded to his father. Mr. Gibson laid down the letter without speaking a word for some time. Then he said, "He'll have to pay a pretty sum for insuring his life beyond seas."
"He's got his fellowship money,"
said the squire, a little depressed at Mr. Gibson's remark.
"Yes, that's true, and he's a strong young fellow, as I know."
"I wish I could tell his mother,"
said the squire in an undertone.
"It seems all settled now," said Mr. Gibson, more in reply to his own thoughts than to the squire's remark.
"Yes," said the squire, "and they're not going to let the grass grow under his feet. He's to be off as soon as he can get his scientific traps ready. I almost wish he wasn't to go. You don't seem quite to like it, doctor."
"Yes, I do," said Mr. Gibson in a more cheerful tone than before. "It can't be helped now without doing a mischief," thought he to himself. "Why, squire, I think it a great honour to have such a son. I envy you, that's what I do. Here's a lad of 3 or 4 and 20 distinguishing himself in more ways than one, and as simple and affectionate at home as any fellow need to be, not a bit set up."
"Ay, ay, he's twice as much a son to me as Osborne, who has been all his life set up on nothing at all, as one may say."
"Come, squire, I mustn't hear anything against Osborne. We may praise one without hitting at the other. Osborne hasn't had the strong health which has enabled Roger to work as he has done. I met a man who knew his tutor at Trinity the other day, and of course we began cracking about Roger. It's not every day that one can reckon a senior wrangler amongst one's friends, and I'm nearly as proud of the lad as you are. This Mr. Mason told me the tutor said that only half of Roger's success was owing to his mental powers. The other half was owing to his perfect health, which enabled him to work harder and more continuously than most men without suffering. He said that in all his experience he had never known any one with an equal capacity for mental labour, and that he could come again with a fresh appetite to his studies after shorter intervals of rest than most. Now I, being a doctor, trace a good deal of his superiority to the material cause of a thoroughly good constitution, which Osborne hasn't got."
"Osborne might have if he'd got out of doors more,"
said the squire moodily.
"But except when he can loaf into Hollingford, he doesn't care to go out at all. I hope,"
he continued with a glance of sudden suspicion at Mr. Gibson.
"He's not after one of your girls? I don't mean offence, you know, but he'll have the estate, and it won't be free, and he must marry money. I don't think I could allow it in Roger. But Osborne's the eldest son, you know."
Mr. Gibson reddened. He was offended for a moment. Then the partial truth of what the squire said was presented to his mind, and he remembered their old friendship, so he spoke quietly, if shortly.
"I don't believe that there's anything of the kind going on. I'm not much at home, you know, but I've never heard or seen anything that should make me suppose that there is. When I do, I'll let you know." "Now, Gibson, don't go and be offended. I'm glad for the boys to have a pleasant house to go to, and I thank you and Mrs. Gibson for making it pleasant. Only keep off love. It can come to no good. That's all. I don't believe Osborne will ever earn a farthing to keep a wife during my life, and if I were to die to-morrow, she would have to bring some money to clear the estate. And if I do speak as I shouldn't have done formerly, a little sharp or so, why, it's because I've been worried by many a care no one knows anything of."
"I am not going to take offence," said Mr. Gibson, "but let us understand each other clearly. If you don't want your sons to come as much to my house as they do, tell them so yourself. I like the lads, and I am glad to see them, but if they do come, you must take the consequences, whatever they are, and not blame me, or them either, for what may happen from the frequent intercourse between two young men and two young women. And what is more, though, as I said, I see nothing whatever of the kind you fear at present, and have promised to tell you of the first symptoms I do see, yet further than that I won't go. If there's an attachment at any future time, I won't interfere."
"I shouldn't so much mind if Roger fell in love with your Molly. He can fight for himself, you see, and she's an uncommon nice girl. My poor wife was so fond of her," answered the squire. "It's Osborne and the estate I'm thinking of."
"Well, then, tell him not to come near us. I shall be sorry, but you will be safe."
"I'll think about it, but he's difficult to manage. I've always to get my blood well up before I can speak my mind to him."
Mr. Gibson was leaving the room, but at these words he turned and laid his hand on the squire's arm. "Take my advice, squire. As I said, there's no harm done as yet, as far as I know. Prevention is better than cure. Speak out, but speak gently to Osborne, and do it at once. I shall understand how it is if he doesn't show his face for some months in my house. If you speak gently to him, he'll take the advice as from a friend. If he can assure you there's no danger, of course he'll come just as usual when he likes." It was all very fine giving the squire this good advice, but as Osborne had already formed the very kind of marriage his father most appreciated, it did not act quite as well as Mr. Gibson had hoped. The squire began the conversation with unusual self-control, but he grew irritated when Osborne denied his father's right to interfere in any marriage he might contemplate, denied it with a certain degree of doggedness and weariness of the subject that drove the squire into one of his passions, and although, on after reflection, he remembered that he had his son's promise and solemn word not to think of either Cynthia or Molly for his wife, yet the father and son had passed through one of those altercations which help to estrange men for life. Each had said bitter things to the other, and if the brotherly affection had not been so true between Osborne and Roger, they too might have become alienated in consequence of the squire's exaggerated and injudicious comparison of their characters and deeds. But as Roger in his boyhood had loved Osborne too well to be jealous of the praise and love which the eldest son, the beautiful brilliant lad, had received, to the disparagement of his own plain awkwardness and slowness, so now Osborne strove against any feeling of envy or jealousy with all his might. But his efforts were conscious, Roger's had been the simple consequence of affection, and the end to poor Osborne was that he became moody and depressed in mind and body. But both father and son concealed their feelings in Roger's presence. When he came home just before sailing, busy and happy, the squire caught his infectious energy, and Osborne looked up and was cheerful. There was no time to be lost. He was bound to a hot climate, and must take all advantage possible of the winter months. He was to go first to Paris, to have interviews with some of the scientific men there. Some of his outfit, instruments, etc., were to follow him to Havre, from which fort he was to embark, after transacting his business in Paris. The squire learnt all his arrangements and plans, and even tried in after-dinner conversations to penetrate into the questions involved in the researches his son was about to make.
but Roger's visit home could not be prolonged beyond 2 days. The last day he rode into Hollingford earlier than he needed to have done to catch the London coach, in order to bid the Gibsons good-bye. He had been too actively busy for some time to have leisure to bestow much thought on Cynthia, but there was no need for fresh meditation on that subject. Her image as a prize to be worked for, to be served for 7 years, and 7 years more, was safe and sacred in his heart. It was very bad, this going away, and wishing her good-bye for 2 long years, and he wondered much during his ride how far he should be justified in telling her mother, perhaps in telling her own sweet self, what his feelings were without expecting, nay, indeed reprobating, any answer on her part. Then she would know at any rate how dearly she was beloved by one who was absent, how in all difficulties or dangers the thought of her would be a polar star, high up in the heavens, and so on, for with all a lover's quickness of imagination and triteness of fancy, he called her a star, a flower, a nymph, a witch, an angel, or a mermaid, a nightingale, a siren, as one or another of her attributes rose up before him. Chapter 33. And daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters by Mrs Gaskell. Chapter 34. A Lover's Mistake. It was afternoon. Molly had gone out for a walk. Mrs Gibson had been paying some calls. Lazy Cynthia had declined accompanying either. A daily walk was not a necessity to her as it was to Molly. On a lovely day, or with an agreeable object, or when the fancy took her, she could go as far as any one, but these were exceptional cases. In general she was not disposed to disturb herself from her indoor occupations. Indeed, not one of the ladies would have left the house had they been aware that Roger was in the neighbourhood, for they were aware that he was to come down but once before his departure, and that his stay at home then would be but for a short time, and they were all anxious to wish him good-bye before his long absence. But they had understood that he was not coming to the Hall until the following week, and therefore they had felt themselves at full liberty this afternoon to follow their own devices. Molly chose a walk that had been a favourite with her ever since she was a child. Something or other had happened just before she left home that made her begin wondering how far it was right for the sake of domestic peace to pass over without comment the little deviations from right that people perceive in those whom they live with, or whether, as they are placed in families for distinct purposes, not by chance merely, there are not duties involved in this aspect of their lot in life, whether by continually passing over failings their own standard is not lowered, the practical application of these thoughts being a dismal sort of perplexity on Molly's part as to whether her father was quite aware of her stepmother's perpetual lapses from truth, and whether his blindness was wilful or not. Then she felt bitterly enough that although she was sure as could be that there was no real estrangement between her and her father, yet there were perpetual obstacles thrown in the way of their intercourse, and she thought with a sigh that if he would but come in with authority he might cut his way clear to the old intimacy with his daughter, and that they might have all the former walks and talks and quips and cranks and glimpses of real confidence once again, things that her stepmother did not value, yet which she, like the dog in the manger, prevented Molly's enjoying. But after all, Molly was a girl, not so far removed from childhood, and in the middle of her grave regrets and perplexities, her eye was caught by the sight of some fine ripe blackberries flourishing away high up on the hedge-bank among scarlet hips and green and russet leaves. She did not care much for blackberries herself, but she had heard Cynthia say that she liked them, and besides, there was the charm of scrambling and gathering them, so she forgot all about her troubles, and went climbing up the banks and clutching at her almost inaccessible prizes, and slipping down again triumphant, to carry them back to the large leaf which was to serve her as a basket. One or two of them she tasted, but they were as vapid to her palate as ever. The skirt of her pretty print gown was torn out of the gathers, and even with the fruit she had eaten, her pretty lips with blackberries were all besmeared and dyed, when, having gathered as many and more than she could possibly carry, she set off home, hoping to escape into her room and mend her gown before it had offended Mrs Gibson's neat eye. The front door was easily opened from the outside, as Molly was out of the clear light of the open air and in the shadow of the hall, when she saw a face peep out of the dining-room before she quite recognized whose it was,
and then Mrs. Gibson came softly out, sufficiently at least to beckon her into the room. When Molly had entered, Mrs. Gibson closed the door. Poor Molly expected a reprimand for her torn gown and untidy appearance, but was soon relieved by the expression of Mrs. Gibson's face, mysterious and radiant. "I've been watching for you, dear. Don't go into the upstairs drawing-room, love. It might be a little interruption just now. Roger Hamley is there with Cynthia, and I've reason to think—in fact, I did open the door unawares, but I shut it again softly, and I don't think they heard me. Isn't it charming? Young love, you know. Oh, how sweet it is!" "Do you mean that Roger has proposed to Cynthia?" asked Molly. "Not exactly that, but I don't know. Of course I know nothing, only I did hear him say that he had meant to leave England without speaking of his love, but that the temptation of seeing her alone had been too great for him. It was symptomatic, don't you think, my dear? And all I wanted was to let it come to a crisis without interruption. So I've been watching for you to prevent your going in and disturbing them." "But I may go to my own room, mayn't I?" pleaded Molly. "Of course," said Mrs. Gibson a little testily. "Only I had expected sympathy from you at such an interesting moment." But Molly did not hear these last words. She had escaped upstairs and shut her door. Instinctively she had carried her leaf full of blackberries. What would blackberries be to Cynthia now? She felt as if she could not understand it all, but for that matter, what could she understand? Nothing. For a few minutes her brain seemed in too great a whirl to comprehend anything but that she was being carried on in earth's diurnal course, with rocks and stones and trees, with as little volition on her part as if she were dead. Then the room grew stifling, and instinctively she went to the open casement window, and leant out, gasping for breath. Gradually the consciousness of the soft, peaceful landscape stole into her mind, and stilled the buzzing confusion. There, bathed in the almost level rays of the autumn sunlight, lay the landscape she had known and loved from childhood, as quiet, as full of low humming life as it had been at this hour for many generations. The autumn flowers blazed out in the garden below, the lazy cows were in the meadow beyond, chewing their cud in the green aftermath, the evening fires had just been made up in the cottages beyond, in preparation for the husband's home-coming, and were sending up soft curls of blue smoke into the still air. The children let loose from school were shouting merrily in the distance, and just then she heard nearer sounds, an opened door, steps on the lower flight of stairs. He could not have gone without seeing her. He never, never would have done so cruel a thing, never would have forgotten poor little Molly, however happy he might be. No, there were steps and voices, and the drawing-room door was opened and shut once more. She laid down her head on her arms that rested upon the window-sill, and cried. She had been so distrustful as to have let the idea enter her mind that he could go without wishing her good-bye. Her, whom his mother had so loved, and called by the name of his dead little sister. And as she thought of the tender love Mrs. Hamley had borne her, she cried the more, for the vanishing of such love for her off the face of the earth. Suddenly the drawing-room door opened, and some one was heard coming upstairs. It was Cynthia's step. Molly hastily wiped her eyes, and stood up and tried to look unconcerned. It was all she had time to do before Cynthia, after a little pause at the closed door, had knocked, and on an answer being given, had said, without opening the door, "Molly, Mr. Roger Hamley is here, and wants to wish you good-bye before he goes." Then she went downstairs again, as if anxious just at that moment to avoid even so short a tete-a-tete with Molly. With a gulp and a fit of resolution, as a child makes up its mind to swallow a nauseous dose of medicine, Molly went instantly downstairs. Roger was talking earnestly to Mrs. Gibson in the bow of the window when Molly entered. Cynthia was standing near, listening, but taking no part in the conversation. Her eyes were downcast, and she did not look up as Molly drew shyly near. Roger was saying, "I could never forgive myself if I had accepted a pledge from her. She shall be free until my return. But the hope, the words, her sweet goodness, have made me happy beyond description. Oh, Molly!" suddenly becoming aware of her presence, and turning to her, and taking her hand in both of his. "I think you have long guessed my secret, have you not? I once thought of speaking to you before I left, and confiding it all to you, but the temptation has been too great. I have told Cynthia how fondly I love her, as far as words can tell, and she says—" Then he looked at Cynthia with a passionate delight, and seemed to forget in that gaze that he had left his sentence to Molly half finished.
Cynthia did not seem inclined to repeat her saying, whatever it was, but her mother spoke for her. My dear sweet girl values your love as it ought to be valued, I am sure, and I believe, looking at Cynthia and Roger with intelligent archness, I could tell tales as to the cause of her indisposition in the spring. Mother, said Cynthia suddenly, you know it was no such thing. Pray don't invent stories about me. I have engaged myself to Mr. Roger Hamley, and that is enough. Enough, more than enough, said Roger. I will not accept your pledge. I am bound, but you are free. I like to feel bound, it makes me happy and at peace, but with all the chances involved in the next 2 years, you must not shackle yourself by promises. Cynthia did not speak at once. She was evidently revolving something in her own mind. Mrs. Gibson took up the word. You are very generous, I am sure. Perhaps it will be better not to mention it. I would much rather have kept it a secret, said Cynthia, interrupting. Certainly, my dear love, that was just what I was going to say. I once knew a young lady who heard of the death of a young man in America whom she had known pretty well, and she immediately said she had been engaged to him, and even went so far as to put on weeds, and it was a false report, for he came back well and merry, and declared to everybody he had never so much as thought about her, so it is very awkward for her. These things had much better be kept secret until the proper time has come for divulging them. Even then and there Cynthia could not resist the temptation of saying, Mamma, I will promise you I won't put on weeds, whatever reports come of Mr. Roger Hamley. Roger, please, he put in a tender whisper. And you will be all witnesses that he has professed to think of me, if he is tempted afterwards to deny the fact. But at the same time I wish it to be kept a secret until his return, and I am sure you will all be so kind as to attend to my wish. Please, Roger. Please, Molly. Mamma, I must especially beg it of you. Roger would have granted anything when she asked him by that name, and in that tone. He took her hand in silent pledge of his reply. Molly felt as if she could never bring herself to name the affair as a common piece of news. So it was only Mrs. Gibson that answered aloud, My dear child, why especially to poor me? You know I'm the most trustworthy person alive. The little pendule on the chimney-piece struck the half-hour. I must go, said Roger in dismay. I had no idea it was so late. I shall write from Paris. The coach will be at the George by this time, and will only stay 5 minutes. Dearest Cynthia. He took her hand, and then, as if the temptation was irresistible, he drew her to him and kissed her. Only remember, you are free, said he, as he released her and passed on to Mrs. Gibson. If I had considered myself free, said Cynthia, blushing a little, but ready with her repartee to the last, if I had thought myself free, do you think I would have allowed that? Then Molly's turn came, and the old brotherly tenderness came back into his look, his voice, his bearing. Molly, you won't forget me, I know. I shall never forget you, nor your goodness to her. His voice began to quiver, and it was best to be gone. Mrs. Gibson was pouring out, unheard and unheeded, words of farewell. Cynthia was rearranging some flowers in a vase on the table, the defects in which had caught her artistic eye, without the consciousness penetrating to her mind. Molly stood, numb to the heart, neither glad nor sorry, nor anything but stunned. She felt the slackened touch of the warm, grasping hand. She looked up, for till now her eyes had been downcast, as if there were heavy weights to their lids, and the place was empty where he had been. His quick step was heard on the stair, the front door was opened and shut, and then as quick as lightning Molly ran up to the front attic, the lumber room, whose window commanded the street down which he must pass. The window clasp was unused and stiff, and Molly tugged at it, unless it was open, and her head put out, that last chance would be gone. I must see him again. I must, she wailed out as she was pulling. There he was, running hard to catch the London coach. His luggage had been left at the George before he came up to wish the Gibsons good-bye. In all his hurry, Molly saw him turn round and shade his eyes from the level rays of the westering sun, and rake the house with his glances, in hopes, she knew, of catching one more glimpse of Cynthia. But apparently he saw no one, not even Molly at the attic casement, for she had drawn back when he had turned, and kept herself in shadow, for she had no right to put herself forward as the one to watch and yearn for farewell signs. None came, Another moment, he was out of sight for years. She shut the window softly and shivered all over. She left the attic and went to her own room, but she did not begin to take off her out-of-door things till she heard Cynthia's foot on the stairs. Then she hastily went to the toilet-table and began to untie her bonnet-strings, but they were in a knot and took time to undo. Cynthia's step stopped at Molly's door. She opened it a little and said, "May I come in, Molly?" "Certainly," said Molly, longing to be able to say no all the time. Molly did not turn to meet her, so Cynthia came up behind her, and putting her two hands round Molly's waist, peeped over her shoulder, putting out her lips to be kissed. Molly could not resist the action, the mute entreaty for a caress. But in the moment before, she had caught the reflection of the two faces in the glass, her own, red-eyed, pale, with lips dyed with blackberry juice, her curls tangled, her bonnet pulled awry, her gown torn, and contrasted it with Cynthia's brightness and bloom, and the trim elegance of her dress. "Oh, it is no wonder," thought poor Molly, as she turned round and put her arms round Cynthia, and laid her head for an instant on her shoulder, the weary, aching head that sought a loving pillow in that supreme moment. The next she had raised herself, and taken Cynthia's two hands, and was holding her off a little, the better to read her face. "Cynthia, you do love him dearly, don't you?" Cynthia winced a little aside from the penetrating steadiness of those eyes. "You speak with all the solemnity of an adjuration, Molly," said she, laughing a little at first to cover her nervousness, and then looking up at Molly. "Don't you think I've given a proof of it? But you know I've often told you I've not the gift of loving. I said pretty much the same thing to him. I can respect, and I fancy I can admire, and I can like, but I never feel carried off my feet by love for any one, not even for you, little Molly, and I am sure I love you more than—" "No, don't," said Molly, putting her hand before Cynthia's mouth in almost a passion of impatience. "Don't, don't, I won't hear you. I ought not to have asked you. It makes you tell lies." "Why, Molly," said Cynthia, in her turn seeking to read Molly's face, "what's the matter with you? One might think you cared for him yourself." "I?" said Molly, all the blood rushing to her heart suddenly. Then it returned, and she had courage to speak, and she spoke the truth as she believed it, though not the real actual truth. "I do care for him. I think you have won the love of a prince amongst men. Why, I am proud to remember that he has been to me as a brother, and I love him as a sister, and I love you doubly because he has honoured you with his love." "Come, that's not complimentary," said Cynthia, laughing, but not ill-pleased to hear her lover's praises, and even willing to depreciate him a little in order to hear more. "He's well enough, I dare say, and a great deal too learned and clever for a stupid girl like me, but even you must acknowledge he's very plain and awkward, and I like pretty things and pretty people." "Cynthia, I won't talk to you about him. You know you don't mean what you are saying, and you only say it out of contradiction because I praise him. He shan't be run down by you, even in joke." "Well, then, we won't talk of him at all. I was so surprised when he began to speak so." And Cynthia looked very lovely, blushing and dimpling up as she remembered his words and looks. Suddenly she recalled herself to the present time, and her eye caught on the leaf full of blackberries, the broad green leaf, so fresh and crisp when Molly had gathered it an hour or so ago, but now soft and flabby and dying. Molly saw it too, and felt a strange kind of sympathetic pity for the poor inanimate leaf. "Oh, what blackberries! You've gathered them for me, I know," said Cynthia, sitting down and beginning to feed herself daintily, touching them lightly with the ends of her taper fingers, and dropping each ripe berry into her open mouth. When she had eaten about half, she suddenly stopped short. "How I should like to have gone as far as Paris with him!" she exclaimed. "I suppose it wouldn't have been proper, but how pleasant it would have been! I remember at Boulogne," another blackberry, "how I used to envy the English who were going to Paris. It seemed to me then as if nobody stopped at Boulogne but dull, stupid schoolgirls." "When will he be there?" asked Molly. "On Wednesday, he said. I'm to write to him there. At any rate, he's going to write to me." Molly went about the adjustment of her dress in a quiet, business-like manner, not speaking much. Cynthia, although sitting still, seemed very restless. Oh, how much Molly wished that she would go. "Perhaps, after all," said Cynthia, after a pause of apparent meditation. "We shall never be married." "Why do you say that?" said Molly, almost bitterly. "You have nothing to make you think so. I wonder how you can bear to think you won't, even for a moment." "Oh," said Cynthia, "you mustn't go and take me au grand sérieux. I dare say I don't mean what I say, but you see everything seems a dream at present. Still, I think the chances are equal, the chances for and against our marriage, I mean. 2 years! It's a long time. He may change his mind, or I may, or some one else may turn up, and I may get engaged to him. What should you think of that, Molly? I'm putting such a gloomy thing as death quite on one side, you see, yet in 2 years how much may happen." "Don't talk so, Cynthia, please don't," said Molly, piteously. "One would think you didn't care for him, and he cares so much for you." "Why did I say I didn't care for him? I was only calculating chances. I'm sure I hope nothing will happen to prevent the marriage. Only you know it may, and I thought I was taking a step in wisdom, in looking forward to all the evils that might befall. I'm sure all the wise people I've ever known thought it a virtue to have gloomy prognostics of the future. But you're not in a mood for wisdom or virtue, I see, so I'll go and get ready for dinner, and leave you to your vanities of dress." She took Molly's face in both her hands, before Molly was aware of her intention, and kissed it playfully. Then she left Molly to herself. End of chapter 34. Wives and Daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters, by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 35. The Mother's Manoeuvre. Mr. Gibson was not at home at dinner, detained by some patient, most probably. This was not an unusual occurrence, but it was rather an unusual occurrence for Mrs. Gibson to go down into the dining-room and sit with him as he ate his deferred meal when he came in an hour or 2 later. In general she preferred her easy-chair, or her corner of the sofa upstairs in the drawing-room, though it was very rarely that she would allow Molly to avail herself of her stepmother's neglected privilege. Molly would fain have gone down and kept her father company every night that he had these solitary meals, but for peace and quietness she gave up her own wishes on the matter. Mrs. Gibson took a seat by the fire in the dining-room, and patiently waited for the auspicious moment when Mr. Gibson, having satisfied his healthy appetite, turned from the table and took his place by her side. She got up, and with unaccustomed attention moved the wine and glasses so that he could help himself without moving from his chair. "There now, are you comfortable? For I have a great piece of news to tell you," said she, when all was arranged.
"I thought there was something on hand," said he, smiling. "Now for it."
"Roger Hamley has been here this afternoon to bid us good-bye."
"Good-bye? Is he gone? I didn't know he was going so soon," exclaimed Mr. Gibson.
"Yes, never mind, that's not it."
"But tell me, he has left this neighbourhood. I wanted to have seen him."
Yes, he left love and regret, and all that sort of thing for you. Now let me get on with my story. He found Cynthia alone, proposed to her, and was accepted."
"Cynthia? Roger proposed to her, and she accepted him?" repeated Mr. Gibson slowly.
"Yes, to be sure. Why not? You speak as if it was something so very surprising."
"Did I? But I am surprised. He's a very fine young fellow, and I wish Cynthia joy, but do you like it? It will have to be a very long engagement."
"Perhaps," said she, in a knowing manner.
"At any rate, he'll be away for 2 years," said Mr. Gibson.
"A great deal may happen in 2 years," she replied.
"Yes, he will have to run many risks and go into many dangers, and will come back no nearer to the power of maintaining a wife than when he went out."
"I don't know that," she replied, still in the arch manner of one possessing superior knowledge. "A little bird did tell me that Osborne's life is not so very secure, and then what will Roger be? Heir to the estate."
"Who told you that about Osborne?"
said he, facing round upon her, and frightening her with his sudden sternness of voice and manner. It seemed as if absolute fire came out of his long, dark, sombre eyes. "Who told you, I say?" She made a faint rally back into her former playfulness. "Why, can you deny it? Is it not the truth?" "I ask you again, Hyacinth, who told you that Osborne Hamley's life is in more danger than mine or yours?" "Oh, don't speak in that frightening way. My life is not in danger, I'm sure, nor yours either, love, I hope." He gave an impatient movement, and knocked a wine-glass off the table. For the moment she felt grateful for the diversion, and busied herself in picking up the fragments. "Bits of glass were so dangerous," she said. But she was startled by a voice of command such as she had never yet heard from her husband. "Never mind the glass. I ask you again, Hyacinth, who told you anything about Osborne Hamley's state of health?" "I am sure I wish no harm to him, and I dare say he is in very good health, as you say," whispered she at last. "Who told?" began he again, sterner than ever. "Well, if you will know, and will make such a fuss about it," said she, driven to extremity, "it was you yourself. You, or Dr. Nicholls, I am sure I forget which." "I never spoke to you on the subject, and I don't believe Nicholls did. You'd better tell me at once what you're alluding to, for I'm resolved we'll have it out before you leave this room." "I wish I'd never married again," she said, now fairly crying, and looking round the room, as if in vain search for a mouse-hole in which to hide herself. Then, as if the sight of the door into the store-room gave her courage, she turned and faced him. "You should not talk your medical secrets so loud, then, if you don't want people to hear them. I had to go into the store-room that day Dr. Nicholls was here. Cook wanted a jar of preserve, and stopped me just as I was going out. I am sure it was for no pleasure of mine, for I was sadly afraid of sticking my gloves. It was all that you might have a comfortable dinner." She looked as if she was going to cry again, but he gravely motioned for her to go on, merely saying, "Well, you overheard our conversation, I suppose?" "Not much," she answered eagerly, almost relieved by being thus helped out in her forced confession. "Only a sentence or two." "What were they?" he asked. "Why, you had just been saying something, and Dr. Nicholls said, if he has got aneurism of the aorta, his days are numbered." "Well, anything more?" "Yes, you said, I hope to God I may be mistaken, but there is a pretty clear indication of symptoms, in my opinion." "How do you know we were speaking of Osborne Hamley?" he asked, perhaps in hopes of throwing her off the scent. But as soon as she perceived that he was descending to her level of subterfuge, she took courage, and said in a quite different tone to the cowed one which she had been using, "Oh, I know. I heard his name mentioned by you both before I began to listen." "Then you own you did listen?" "Yes," said she, hesitating a little now. "And pray, how do you come to remember so exactly the name of the disease spoken of?" "Because I went— Now, don't be angry, I really can't see any harm in what I did." "Then don't deprecate anger. You went—" "Into the surgery and looked it out. Why might not I?" Mr. Gibson did not answer, did not look at her. His face was very pale, and both forehead and lips were contracted. At length he roused himself, sighed, and said, "Well, I suppose as one brews one must bake." "I don't understand what you mean," pouted she. "Perhaps not," he replied. "I suppose that it was what you heard on that occasion that made you change your behaviour to Roger Hamley. I've noticed how much more civil you were to him of late." "If you mean that I have ever got to like him as much as Osborne, you are very much mistaken. No, not even though he is offered to Cynthia, and is to be my son-in-law." "Let me know the whole affair. You overheard. I will own that it was Osborne about whom we were speaking, though I shall have something to say about that presently. And then, if I understand you rightly, you changed your behaviour to Roger, and made him more welcome to this house than you had ever done before, regarding him as proximate heir to the Hamley estates." "I don't know what you mean by proximate." "Go into the surgery and look into the dictionary, then," said he, losing his temper for the first time during the conversation. "I knew," said she, through sobs and tears, "that Roger had taken a fancy to Cynthia. Any one might see that, and as long as Roger was only a younger son, with no profession, and nothing but his fellowship, I thought it right to discourage him, as any one would who had a grain of common sense in them. For a clumsier, more common, awkward, stupid fellow I never saw, to be called county, I mean." Take care. You'll have to eat your words presently when you come to fancy he'll have Hamley some day.
No, I shan't, said she, not perceiving his exact drift. You are vexed now because it is not Molly he's in love with, and I call it very unjust and unfair to my poor fatherless girl. I am sure I have always tried to further Molly's interests, as if she was my own daughter.
Mr. Gibson was too indifferent to this accusation to take any notice of it. He returned to what was of far more importance to him. The point I want to be clear about is this. Did you or did you not alter your behaviour to Roger in consequence of what you overheard of my professional conversation with Dr. Nicholls? Have you not favoured his suit to Cynthia since then, on the understanding gathered from that conversation that he stood a good chance of inheriting Hamley?
I suppose I did, said she sulkily. And if I did, I can't see any harm in it. That I should be questioned as if I were in a witness box. He was in love with Cynthia long before that conversation, and she liked him so much. It was not for me to cross the path of true love. I don't see how you would have a mother show her love for her child if she may not turn accidental circumstances to her advantage. Perhaps Cynthia might have died if she had been crossed in love. Her poor father was consumptive.
Don't you know that all professional conversations are confidential? That it would be the most dishonourable thing possible for me to betray secrets which I learn in the exercise of my profession?
Yes, of course, you.
Well, and are not you and I one in all these respects? You cannot do a dishonourable act without my being inculpated in the disgrace. If it would be a deep disgrace for me to betray a professional secret, what would it be for me to trade on that knowledge? He was trying hard to be patient, but the offence was of that class which galled him insupportably.
I don't know what you mean by trading. Trading in a daughter's affections is the last thing I should do, and I should have thought you would be rather glad than otherwise to get Cynthia well married and off your hands.
Mr. Gibson got up and walked about the room, his hands in his pockets. Once or twice he began to speak, but he stopped impatiently short without going on. I don't know what to say to you, he said at length. You either can't or won't see what I mean. I'm glad enough to have Cynthia here. I have given her a true welcome, and I sincerely hope she will find this house as much a home as my own daughter does. But for the future, I must look out of my doors, and double-lock the approaches if I am so foolish as to— However, that's past and gone, and it remains with me to prevent its recurrence as far as I can for the future. Now let us hear the present state of affairs.
I don't think I ought to tell you anything about it. It is a secret, just as much as your mysteries are.
Very well. You have told me enough to me to act upon, which I most certainly shall do. It was only the other day I promised the squire to let him know if I suspected anything, any love affair or entanglement, much less an engagement, between either of his sons and our girls.
But this is not an engagement. He would not let it be so. If you would only listen to me, I would tell you all. Only I do hope you won't go and tell the squire and everybody. Cynthia did so beg that it might not be known. It is only my unfortunate frankness that has led me into this scrape. I never could keep a secret from those whom I love.
I must tell the squire. I shall not mention it to anyone else. And do you think it was quite consistent with your general frankness to have overheard what you did, and never to have mentioned it to me? I could have told you that when Dr. Nicholls' opinion was decidedly opposed to mine, and that he believed that the disturbance about which I consulted him on Osborne's behalf was merely temporary. Dr. Nicholls will tell you that Osborne is as likely as any man to live, and marry, and beget children. If there was any skill used by Mr. Gibson so to word this speech as to conceal his own opinion, Mrs. Gibson was not sharp enough to find it out. She was dismayed, and Mr. Gibson enjoyed her dismay. It restored him to something like his usual frame of mind. Let us review this misfortune, for I see you consider it as much, he said.
No, not quite a misfortune, said she. But certainly if I had known Dr. Nicholls' opinion—
She hesitated. You see the advantage of always consulting me, he said gravely. Here is Cynthia engaged.
Not engaged, as I told you before. He would not allow it to be considered an engagement on her part.
Well, entangled in a love affair with a lad of 23, with nothing beyond his fellowship and a chance of inheriting an encumbered estate, no profession even, abroad for 2 years, and I must go and tell his father all about it to-morrow.
Oh dear,
Pray say that if he dislikes it, he is only to express his opinion. I don't think you can act without Cynthia in the affair, and if I am not mistaken, Cynthia will have a pretty stout will of her own on the subject. Oh, I don't think she cares for him very much. She is not one to be always falling in love, and she does not take things very deeply to heart. But, of course, one would not do anything abruptly. 2 years' absence gives one plenty of time to turn oneself in. But a little while ago we were threatened with consumption and an early death if Cynthia's affections were thwarted. Oh, you dear creature, how you remember all my silly words! It might be, you know. Poor dear Mr. Kirkpatrick was consumptive, and Cynthia may have inherited it, and great sorrow might bring out the latent seeds. At times I am so fearful. But I dare say it is not probable, for I don't think she takes things very deeply to heart. Then I am quite at liberty to give up the affair, acting as Cynthia's proxy, if the squire disapproves of it. Poor Mrs. Gibson was in a strait at this question. No, she said at last, we cannot give it up. I am sure Cynthia would not, especially if she thought others were acting for her, and he really is very much in love. I wish he were in Osborne's place. Shall I tell you what I should do? Said Mr. Gibson in real earnest. However it may have been brought about, here are 2 young people in love with each other. One is as fine a young fellow as ever breathed, the other a very pretty, lively, agreeable girl. The father of the young man must be told, and it is most likely he will bluster and oppose, for there is no doubt it an improvement affair as far as money goes. But let them be steady and patient, and a better lot need await no young woman. I only wish it were Molly's good fortune to meet with such another. I will try for her, I will indeed, said Mrs. Gibson, relieved by his change of tone. No, don't. That's one thing I forbid. I'll have no trying for Molly. Well, don't be angry, dear. Do you know, I was quite afraid you were going to lose your temper at one time. It would have been of no use, said he gloomily, getting up as if to close the sitting. His wife was only too glad to make her escape. The conjugal interview had not been satisfactory to either. Mr. Gibson had been compelled to face and acknowledge the fact that the wife he had chosen had a very different standard of conduct from that which he had upheld all his life, and had hoped to have seen inculcated in his daughter. He was more irritated than he chose to show, for there was so much of self-reproach in his irritation that he kept it to himself, brooded over it, and allowed a feeling of suspicious dissatisfaction with his wife to grow up in his mind, which extended itself by and by to the innocent Cynthia, and caused his manner to both mother and daughter to assume a certain curt severity, which took the latter at any rate with extreme surprise. But on the present occasion he followed his wife up to the drawing-room, and gravely congratulated the astonished Cynthia. "Has mamma told you?" said she, shooting an indignant glance at her mother. "It is hardly an engagement, and we all pledged ourselves to keep it a secret, mamma among the rest." "But, my dearest Cynthia, you could not have wished me to keep a secret from my husband," pleaded Mrs. Gibson. "No, perhaps not. At any rate, sir," said Cynthia, turning towards him with graceful frankness, "I am glad you should know it. You have always been a most kind friend to me, and I dare say I should have told you myself, but I did not want it named. If you please, it must still be a secret. In fact, it is hardly an engagement. She blushed and sparkled a little at the euphuism, which implied that there was but one he present in her thoughts at the moment, would not allow me to bind myself by any promise until his return." Mr. Gibson looked gravely at her, irresponsive to her winning looks, which at the moment reminded him too forcibly of her mother's ways. Then he took her hand, and said seriously enough, "I hope you are worthy of him, Cynthia, for you have indeed drawn a prize. I have never known a truer or warmer heart than Roger's, and I have known him boy and man." Molly felt as if she could have thanked her father aloud for this testimony to the value of him who was gone away. But Cynthia pouted a little before she smiled up in his face. "You are not complimentary, are you, Mr. Gibson?" said she. "He thinks me worthy, I suppose, and if you have so high an opinion of him, you ought to respect his judgment of me." If she hoped to provoke a compliment, she was disappointed, for Mr. Gibson let her hand go in an absent manner, and sat down in an easy-chair by the fire, gazing at the wood embers as if hoping to read the future in them. Molly saw Cynthia's eyes fill with tears, and followed her to the other end of the room, where she had gone to seek some working materials. "Dear Cynthia," was all she said, but she pressed her hand while trying to assist in the search. "Oh, Molly, I am so fond of your father. What makes him speak so to me to-night?" "I don't know," said Molly. "Perhaps he's tired." They were recalled from further conversation by Mr. Gibson. He had roused himself from his reverie, and was now addressing Cynthia. "I hope you'll not consider it a breach of confidence, Cynthia, but I must tell the squire of what has taken place to-day between you and his son. I have bound myself by a promise to him. He was afraid, it's as well to tell you the truth, he was afraid," an emphasis on this last word, "of something of this kind between his sons and one of you two girls. It was only the other day I assured him there was nothing of the kind on foot, and I told him then I would inform him at once if I saw any symptoms." Cynthia looked extremely annoyed. "It was the one thing I stipulated for, secrecy." "But why?" said Mr. Gibson. "I can understand your not wishing to have it made public under the present circumstances, but the nearest friends on both sides. Surely you can have no objection to that." "Yes, I have," said Cynthia. "I would not have had any one know if I could have helped it." "I'm almost certain Roger will tell his father." "No, he won't," said Cynthia. "I made him promise, and I think he is one to respect a promise," with a glance at her mother, who, feeling herself in disgrace with both husband and child, was keeping a judicious silence. "Well, at any rate, the story would come with so much a better grace from him that I shall give him the chance. I won't go over to the Hall till the end of the week. He may have written and told his father before then." Cynthia held her tongue for a little while. Then she said, with tearful pettishness, "A man's promise is to override a woman's wish, then, is it?" "I don't see any reason why it should not." "Will you trust in my reasons when I tell you it will cause me a great deal of distress if it gets known?" She said this in so pleading a voice that if Mr. Gibson had not been thoroughly displeased and annoyed by his previous conversation with her mother, he must have yielded to her. As it was, he said coldly, "Telling Roger's father is not making it public. I don't like this exaggerated desire for such secrecy, Cynthia. It seems to me as if something more than is apparent was concealed behind it." "Come, Molly," said Cynthia suddenly, "let us sing that duet I've been teaching you. It's better than talking as we are doing." It was a little lively French duet. Molly sang it carelessly, with heaviness at her heart, but Cynthia sang it with spirit and apparent merriment, only she broke down in hysterics at last, and flew upstairs to her own room. Molly, heeding nothing else, neither her father nor Mrs. Gibson's words, followed her, and found the door of her bedroom locked, and for all reply to her entreaties to be allowed to come in, she heard Cynthia sobbing and crying. It was more than a week after the incidents just recorded before Mr. Gibson found himself at liberty to call on the squire, and he heartily hoped that long before then Roger's letter might have arrived from Paris, telling his father the whole story. But he saw at the first glance that the squire had heard nothing unusual to disturb his equanimity. He was looking better than he had done for months past. The light of hope was in his eyes, his face seemed of a healthy ruddy colour, gained partly by his resumption of outdoor employment in the superintendence of the works, and partly because the happiness he had lately had through Roger's means caused his blood to flow with regular vigour. He had felt Roger's going away, it is true, but whenever the sorrow of parting with him pressed too heavily upon him, he filled his pipe and smoked it out over a long, slow, deliberate reperusal of Lord Hollingford's letter, every word of which he knew by heart, but expressions in which he made a pretence to himself of doubting, that he might have an excuse for looking at his son's praises once again. The first greetings over, Mr. Gibson plunged into his subject. "Any news from Roger yet?" "Oh yes, here's his letter," said the squire, producing his black leather case, in which Roger's missive had been placed along with the other very heterogeneous contents. Mr. Gibson read it, hardly seeing the words after he had by one rapid glance assured himself that there was no mention of Cynthia in it. I see he doesn't name one very important event that has befallen him since he left you," said Mr. Gibson, seizing on the first words that came. "I believe I'm committing a breach of confidence on one side, but I'm going to keep the promise I made the last time I was here. I find there is something Something of the kind you apprehended, you understand, between him and my stepdaughter, Cynthia Kirkpatrick. He called at our house to wish us good-bye while waiting for the London coach, found her alone, and spoke to her. They don't call it an engagement, but of course it is one.
Give me back the letter,
said the squire in a constrained kind of voice. Then he read it again, as if he had not previously mastered its contents, and as if there might be some sentence or sentences he had overlooked.
No, he said at last, with a sigh, he tells me nothing about it. Lads may play at confidences with their fathers, but they keep a deal back.
The squire appeared more disappointed at not having heard of this straight from Roger than displeased at the fact itself, Mr. Gibson thought. But he let him take his time.
He's not the eldest son, continued the squire, talking as it were to himself, but it's not the match I should have planned for him. How came you, sir, said he, firing round on Mr. Gibson suddenly, to say, when you were last here, that there was nothing between my sons and either of your girls? Why, this must have been going on all the time.
I'm afraid it was, but I was as ignorant about it as the babe unborn. I only heard of it on the evening of the day of Roger's departure.
And that's a week ago, sir. What's kept you quiet ever since?
I thought that Roger would tell you himself.
That shows you've no sons. More than half their life is unknown to their fathers. Why, Osborne there, we live together, that's to say we have our meals together, and we sleep under the same roof, and yet, well, well, life is as God has made it. You say it's not an engagement yet? But I wonder what I'm doing, hoping for my lad's disappointment in the folly he set his heart on, and just when he's been helping me. Is it a folly, or is it not? I ask you, Gibson, for you must know this girl. She hasn't much money, I suppose?
About £30 a year, at my pleasure during her mother's life.
Phew! It's well he's not Osborne. They'll have to wait. What family is she of? None of 'em in trade, I reckon, from her being so poor.
I believe her father was a grandson of a certain Sir Gerald Kirkpatrick. Her mother tells me it is an old baronetcy. I know nothing of such things.
That's something. I do know something of such things, as you were pleased to call them. I like honourable blood.
Mr. Gibson could not help saying, but I'm afraid that only 1/8 of Cynthia's blood is honourable. I know nothing further of her relations, excepting the fact that her father was a curate.
Professional, that's a step above trade, at any rate. How old is she?
18 or 19.
Pretty?
Yes, I think so. Most people do, but it's all a matter of taste. Come, squire, judge for yourself. Ride over and take lunch with us any day you like. I may not be in, but her mother will be there, and you can make acquaintance with your son's future wife. This was going too fast, however, presuming too much on the quietness with which the squire had been questioning him. Mr. Hamley drew back within his shell, and spoke in a surly manner as he replied,
Roger's future wife! He'll be wiser by the time he comes home. 2 years among the black folk will have put more sense in him.
Possible, but not probable, I should say, replied Mr. Gibson. Black folk are not remarkable for their powers of reasoning, I believe, so that they haven't much chance of altering his opinion by argument, even if they understand each other's language, and certainly if he shares my taste, their peculiarity of complexion will only make him appreciate white-skins the more.
But you said it was no engagement, growled the squire. If he thinks better of it, you won't keep him to it, will you?
If he wishes to break it off, I shall certainly advise Cynthia to be equally willing. That's all I can say. And I see no reason for discussing the affair further at present. I've told you how matters stand, because I promised you I would, if I saw anything of this kind going on. But in the present condition of things, we can neither make nor mar. We can only wait. And he took up his hat to go. But the squire was discontented.
Don't go, Gibson. Don't take offence at what I've said, though I'm sure I don't see why you should. What's the girl like in herself?
I don't know what you mean, said Mr. Gibson. But he did, only he was vexed and did not choose to understand.
Is she like your Molly, sweet-tempered and sensible, with her gloves always mended and neat about the feet, and ready to do anything one asks her, just as if doing it was the very thing she liked best in the world?
Mr. Gibson's face relaxed now, and he could understand all the squire's broken sentences and unexplained meanings. She is much prettier than Molly to begin with, and has very winning ways. She's always well dressed and smart looking, and I know she hasn't much to spend on her clothes, and always does what she's asked to do, and is ready enough with her pretty lively answers. I don't think I ever saw her out of temper, but then I'm not sure if she takes things keenly to heart, and a certain obtuseness of feeling goes a great way toward a character for a good temper, I've observed. Altogether, I think Cynthia is 1 in 100.
The squire meditated a little. Your Molly is 1 in 1,000, to my mind. But then, you see, she comes of no family at all, and I don't suppose she'll have a chance of much money.
This he said as if he were thinking aloud, and without reference to Mr. Gibson, but it nettled the latter, and he replied somewhat impatiently,
Well, but as there's no question of Molly in this business, I don't see the use of bringing her name in, and considering either her family or her fortune. No, to be sure not, said the squire, rousing up. My wits had gone far afield, and I'll own I was only thinking what a pity it was she wouldn't do for Osborne. But of course it's out of the question. Out of the question.
Yes, said Mr. Gibson, and if you will excuse me, squire, I really must go now, and then you'll be at liberty to send your wits afield uninterrupted. This time he was at the door before the squire called him back. He stood impatiently hitting his top boots with his riding whip, waiting for the interminable last words.
I say, Gibson, we're old friends, and you're a fool if you take anything I say as an offence. Madam, your wife and I didn't hit it off the only time I ever saw her. I won't say she was silly, but I think one of us was silly, and it wasn't me. However, we'll pass that over. Suppose you bring her and this girl Cynthia, which is as outlandish a Christian name as I'd wish to hear, and little Molly out here to lunch some day. I'm more at my ease in my own house, and I'm more sure to be civil too. We need say nothing about Roger, neither the lass nor me, and you keep your wife's tongue quiet if you can. It will only be like a compliment to you on your marriage, you know, and no one must take it for anything more. Mind, no allusion or mention of Roger in this piece of folly. I shall see the girl then, and I can judge for myself, for, as you say, that will be the best plan. Osborne will be here too, and he's always in his element talking to women. I sometimes think he's half woman himself, he spends so much money, and is so unreasonable.
The squire was pleased with his own speech and his own thought, and smiled a little as he finished speaking. Mr. Gibson was both pleased and amused, and he smiled too, anxious as he was to be gone. The next Thursday was soon fixed upon as the day on which Mr. Gibson was to bring his womenkind out to the Hall. He thought that, on the whole, the interview had gone off a good deal better than he had expected, and he felt rather proud of the invitation of which he was the bearer. Therefore Mrs. Gibson's manner of receiving it was an annoyance to him. She, meanwhile, had been considering herself as an injured woman ever since the evening of the day of Roger's departure. What business had any one to speak as if the chances of Osborne's life being prolonged were infinitely small, if in fact the matter was uncertain? She liked Osborne extremely, much better than Roger, and would gladly have schemed to secure him for Cynthia, if she had not shrunk from the notion of her daughter's becoming a widow. For if Mrs. Gibson had ever felt anything acutely, it was the death of Mr. Kirkpatrick, and amiably callous as she was in most things, she recoiled from exposing her daughter wilfully to the same kind of suffering which she herself had experienced. But if she had only known Dr. Nicholls' opinion, she would never have favoured Roger's suit, never. And then Mr. Gibson himself, why was he so cold and reserved in his treatment of her since that night of explanation? She had done nothing wrong, yet she was treated as though she were in disgrace, and everything about the house was flat just now. She even missed the little excitement of Roger's visits, and the watching of his attentions to Cynthia. Cynthia, too, was silent enough, and as for Molly, she was absolutely dull and out of spirits, a state of mind so annoying to Mrs. Gibson just now, that she vented some of her discontent upon the poor girl, from whom she feared neither complaint nor repartee. End of chapter 35. Wives and Daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 36. Domestic Diplomacy. The evening of the day on which Mr. Gibson had been to see the squire, the three women were alone in the drawing-room, for Mr. Gibson had had a long round, and was not as yet come in.
They had had to wait dinner for him, and for some time after his return there was nothing done or said but what related to the necessary business of eating. Mr. Gibson was, perhaps, as well satisfied with his day's work as any of the four, for this visit to the squire had been weighing on his mind ever since he had heard of the state of things between Roger and Cynthia. He did not like the having to go and tell of a love affair so soon after he had declared his belief that no such thing existed. It was a confession of fallibility which is distasteful to most men. If the squire had not been of so unsuspicious and simple a nature, he might have drawn his own conclusions from the apparent concealment of facts, and felt doubtful of Mr. Gibson's perfect honesty in the business; but being what he was, there was no danger of such unjust misapprehension. Still Mr. Gibson knew the hot hasty temper he had to deal with, and had expected more violence of language than he really encountered; and the last arrangement by which Cynthia, her mother, and Molly, who, as Mr. Gibson thought to himself and smiled at the thought, was sure to be a peacemaker and a sweetener of intercourse, were to go into the hall and make acquaintance with the squire, appeared like a great success to Mr. Gibson, for achieving which he took not a little credit to himself. Altogether he was more cheerful and bland than he had been for many days, and when he came up into the drawing-room for a few minutes after dinner, before going out again to see his town patients, he whistled a little under his breath, as he stood with his back to the fire, looking at Cynthia, and thinking that he had not done her justice when describing her to the squire. Now this soft, almost tuneless whistling was to Mr. Gibson what purring is to a cat. He could no more have done it with an anxious case on his mind, or when he was annoyed by human folly, or when he was hungry, than he could have flown through the air. Molly knew all this by instinct, and was happy without being aware of it, as soon as she heard the low whistle which was no music after all. But Mrs. Gibson did not like this trick of her husband's. It was not refined, she thought, not even artistic. If she could have called it by this fine word, it would have compensated her for the want of refinement. To-night it was particularly irritating to her nerves, but since her conversation with Mr. Gibson about Cynthia's engagement, she had not felt herself in a sufficiently good position to complain. Mr. Gibson began, "Well, Cynthia, I've seen the squire to-day, and made a clean breast of it." Cynthia looked up quickly, questioning with her eyes. Molly stopped her netting to listen. No one spoke. "You're all to go there on Thursday to lunch. He asked you all, and I promised for you." Still no reply. Natural, perhaps, but very flat. "You'll be glad of that, Cynthia, shan't you?" asked Mr. Gibson. "It may be a little formidable, but I hope it will be the beginning of a good understanding between you." "Thank you," said she, with an effort. But won't it make it public? I do so wish not to have it known, or talked about, not till he comes back, or close upon the marriage."
"I don't see how it should make it public," said Mr. Gibson. "My wife goes to lunch with my friend, and takes her daughters with her. There's nothing in that, is there?"
"I'm not sure that I shall go," put in Mrs. Gibson. She did not know why she said it, for she fully intended to go all the time, but having said it, she was bound to stick to it for a little while, and, with such a husband as hers, the hard necessity was sure to fall upon her of having to find a reason for her saying. Then it came, quick and sharp.
"Why not?"
he said, turning round upon her. "Oh, because I think he ought to have called on Cynthia first. I've that sort of sensitiveness, I can't bear to think of her being slighted because she is poor."
"Nonsense," said Mr. Gibson. "I do assure you, no slight whatever was intended. He does not wish to speak about the engagement to any one, not even to Osborne. That's your wish too, isn't it, Cynthia? Nor does he intend to mention it to any of you when you go there. But naturally enough he wants to make acquaintance with his future daughter-in-law. If he deviated so much from his usual course as to come calling here—"
"I am sure I don't want him to come calling here," said Mrs. Gibson, interrupting. "He was not so very agreeable the only time he did come. But I am that sort of a character that I cannot put up with any neglect of persons I love, just because they are not smiled upon by fortune." She sighed a little ostentatiously as she ended her sentence.
"Well, then, you won't go," said Mr. Gibson, provoked, but not wishing to have a long discussion, especially as he felt his temper going.
"Do you wish it, Cynthia?" said Mrs. Gibson, anxious for an excuse to yield. But her daughter was quite aware of this motive for the question, and replied quietly, "Not particularly, mamma. I am quite willing to refuse the invitation."
"It is already accepted," said Mr. Gibson, almost ready to vow that he would never again meddle in any affair in which women were concerned, which would effectually shut him out from all love affairs for the future. He had been touched by the squire's relenting, pleased with what he had thought would give others pleasure, and this was the end of it. "Oh, do go, Cynthia," said Molly, pleading with her eyes as well as her words. "Do go. I am sure you will like the squire, and it is such a pretty place, and he'll be so much disappointed." "I should not like to give up my dignity," said Cynthia demurely. "And you heard what mamma said." It was very malicious of her. She fully intended to go, and was equally sure that her mother was already planning her dress for the occasion in her mind. Mr. Gibson, however, who, surgeon though he was, had never learnt to anatomize a woman's heart, took it all literally, and was excessively angry both with Cynthia and her mother, so angry that he did not dare to trust himself to speak. He went quickly to the door, intending to leave the room, but his wife's voice arrested him. She said, "My dear, do you wish me to go? If you do, I will put my own feelings on one side." "Of course I do," he said, short and stern, and left the room. "Then I'll go," said she, in the voice of a victim. Those words were meant for him, but he hardly heard them. "And we'll have a fly from the George, and get a livery coat for Thomas, which I've long been wanting, only dear Mr. Gibson did not like it. But on an occasion like this I'm sure he won't mind, and Thomas shall go in the box, and—" "But, mamma, I've my feelings too," said Cynthia. "Nonsense, child, when all is so nicely arranged too." So they went on the day appointed. Mr. Gibson was aware of the change of plans, and that they were going after all, but he was so much annoyed by the manner in which his wife had received an invitation that appeared to him so much kinder than he had expected from his previous knowledge of the squire, and his wishes on the subject of his son's marriage, that Mrs. Gibson heard neither interest nor curiosity expressed by her husband as to the visit itself, or the reception they met with. Cynthia's indifference as to whether the invitation was accepted or not had displeased Mr. Gibson. He was not up to her ways with her mother, and did not understand how much of this said indifference had been assumed in order to countervent Mrs. Gibson's affectation and false sentiment. But for all his annoyance on the subject, he was, in fact, very curious to know how the visit had gone off, and took the first opportunity of being alone with Molly to question her about the lunch of the day before at Hamley Hall. "And so you went to Hamley yesterday after all?"
"Yes, I thought you would have come. The squire seemed quite to expect you."
"I thought of going there at first, but I changed my mind like other people. I don't see why women are to have a monopoly of changeableness. Well, how did it go off? Pleasantly, I suppose, for both your mother and Cynthia were in high spirits last night."
"Yes, the dear old squire was in his best dress and on his best behaviour, and was so prettily attentive to Cynthia, and she looked so lovely, walking about with him and listening to all his talk about the garden and farm. Mamma was tired and stopped indoors, so they got on very well, and saw a great deal of each other."
"And my little girl trotted behind?"
"Oh, yes. You know I was almost at home, and besides, of course—" Molly went very red, and left the sentence unfinished.
"Do you think she's worthy of him?" asked her father, just as if she had completed her speech.
"Of Roger, papa? Oh, who is? But she is very sweet, and very, very charming."
"Very charming, if you will, but somehow I don't quite understand her. Why does she want all this secrecy? Why was she not more eager to go and pay her duty to Roger's father? She took it as coolly as if I'd asked her to go to church."
"I don't think she did take it coolly. I don't believe I quite understand her either, but I love her dearly all the same."
"I like to understand people thoroughly, but I know it's not necessary to women. Do you really think she's worthy of him?"
"Oh, papa,"
said Molly,
and then she stopped. She wanted to speak in favour of Cynthia, but somehow she could form no reply that pleased her to this repeated inquiry. He did not seem to much care whether he got an answer or not, for he went on with his own thoughts, and the result was that he asked Molly if Cynthia had heard from Roger. "Yes, on Wednesday morning."
"Did she show it to you? But of course not. Besides, I read the squire's letter, which told all about him."
Now Cynthia, rather to Molly's surprise, had told her that she might read the letter if she liked, and Molly had shrunk from availing herself of the permission for Roger's sake.
She thought that he would probably have poured out his heart to the one sole person, and that it was not fair to listen, as it were, to his confidences. "Was Osborne at home?" asked Mr. Gibson. "The squire said he did not think he would have come back, but the young fellow was so uncertain." "No, he was still from home." Then Molly blushed all over crimson, for it suddenly struck her that Osborne was probably with his wife, that mysterious wife, of whose existence she was cognizant, but of whom she knew so little, and of whom her father knew nothing. Mr. Gibson noticed the blush with anxiety. What did it mean? It was troublesome enough to find that one of the squire's precious sons had fallen in love with the prohibited ranks, and what would not have to be said and done if anything fresh were to come out between Osborne and Molly? He spoke out at once to relieve himself of this new apprehension. "Molly, I was taken by surprise by this affair between Cynthia and Roger Hamley. If there's anything more on the tapis, let me know at once, honestly and openly. I know it's an awkward question for you to reply to, but I wouldn't ask it unless I had good reasons." He took her hand as he spoke. She looked up at him with clear, truthful eyes, which filled with tears as she spoke. She did not know why the tears came. Perhaps it was because she was not as strong as formerly. "If you mean that you're afraid that Osborne thinks of me as Roger thinks of Cynthia, papa, you are quite mistaken. Osborne and I are friends and nothing more, and never can be anything more. That's all I can tell you." "It's quite enough, little one. It's a great relief. I don't want to have my Molly carried off by any young man just yet. I should miss her sadly." He could not help saying this in the fullness of his heart just then, but he was surprised at the effect these few tender words produced. Molly threw her arms round his neck and began to sob bitterly, her head lying on his shoulder. "There, there," he said, patting her on the back, and leading her to the sofa. "That will do. I get quite enough of tears in the day, shed for real causes, not to want them at home, where I hope they are shed for no cause at all. There's nothing really the matter, is there, my dear?" he continued, holding her a little way from him that he might look in her face. She smiled at him through her tears, and he did not see the look of sadness which returned to her face after he had left her. "Nothing, dear, dear papa, nothing now. It is such a comfort to have you all to myself. It makes me happy." Mr. Gibson knew all implied in these words, and felt that there was no effectual help for the state of things which had arisen from his own act. It was better for them both that they should not speak out more fully. So he kissed her, and said, "That's right, dear. I can leave you in comfort now, and indeed I've stayed too long already gossiping. Go out and have a walk. Take Cynthia with you if you like. I must be off. Good-bye, little one." His commonplace words acted like an astringent on Molly's relaxed feelings. He intended that they should do so. It was the truest kindness to her. But he walked away from her with a sharp pang at his heart, which he stunned into numbness as soon as he could, by throwing himself violently into the affairs and cares of others. Chapter 36.